So I'm really grateful to be joined on pretty short notice by Professor Joseph Hawley from Columbia. Joseph, for people who don't know your work, maybe you can just talk a little bit about what you teach, your department, and your role at Columbia.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I'm a associate professor in the classics department. I'm a professor of Latin. I teach about Latin literature, ancient Rome, Roman cultural history. I'm also involved in our core curriculum at Columbia. So all the first year students take a year-long seminar on the history of literature from Gilgamesh to Toni Morrison, and I teach in that course as well. But additionally, for the last year, I've been involved in organizing, especially with Jewish colleagues on campus, around issues of free speech, academic freedom, and trying to speak out against the instrumentalization of charges of anti-Semitism to suppress the Palestine solidarity movement.
That's great. Well, hopefully one day we'll live in a country and on a campus where you can go back to just focusing on Latin and classics, and I can interview you about that. But so much has been happening vis-a-vis Columbia University just in the last few
Yeah.
days that I thought it would be really, really valuable to talk to someone who's really in the middle of it and seeing it at ground level. So maybe for people who haven't quite been able to digest all of the torrent of news, maybe you can just talk about what's happened the last couple of days vis-a-vis Columbia and the Trump administration that's really significant.
Yeah, well, on Friday, there was an announcement. I think it was maybe a joint announcement from the president's task force to combat anti-Semitism and HHS, maybe that the government was going to be freezing about $400 million in already awarded grant funding to the university to support research. And that's a really substantial chunk of change relative to our overall budget. I mean, that's the kind of thing we sort of knew it was coming, but this was the first big kind of assault in that way. Friday afternoon or evening, we understand that ICE agents managed to gain access to a student apartment building in search of a student who's here on a student visa, although they were not able to take that student. And then last night, a student was seized by federal agents, apparently at the door of his residence near campus. A student called Mahmoud Khalil, who has a green card. He's a permanent U.S. resident. He's Palestinian, and he was involved in negotiating and speaking on behalf of the Gaza Solidarity Encampment protest movement on campus last spring, and he's currently in federal detention. So that's just the last, couple of days, but it seems pretty clear to us that the kind of big hammer of the federal funding freeze coinciding with this direct sort of stunt. Stunt makes it sound like it's not consequential. It's enormously consequential and terrifying, but it seems pretty clear that there's an attempt here to demonstrate that, the university is not going to be able to protect its students or stand up to ICE because we are under the gun with federal funding.
So in this statement, they're going to cut $400 million. Did they cite any evidence about Columbia and anti-Semitism?
I mean, this is the thing, is there's a claim that the university has failed to address rampant harassment of Jewish students. And the tricky thing here is that, I think there's two things we need to say. One is that we have a really challenging climate on campus, and we have had since October 7th. We have a very politically active campus, so we've had a lot of protest activity. As happens anytime there's an escalation of Israeli military activity in occupied Palestine, there's a spike in harassment of Jews and Israelis and people who identify or seem to be identified as Jewish or Israeli. And there's a spike in harassment of Arab and Muslim and Palestinian people on campus. This is a real challenge, and a lot of us have been saying for the last year that the ADL is not here to solve these problems, and following the ADL playbook has not really made it any better. But the second thing to say is that it is simply not the case that the university has not done anything to address this. We have spun up a whole new Office of Institutional Equity. We've all had to take new trainings. And if you can look at reporting from, I think, Murtaza Hussein and Dropsite and Jake Offenhartz in the AP just last week reported on situations where students have been reported to this OIE office for what at any other time would be protected political speech. They're now being investigated and found responsible for anti-Semitism and discrimination against Jews and Israelis. So we're doing so much that we're actually like over enforcing and over correcting. And it does seem like we have sort of a runaway approach to this problem. So, but I think this is very important and telling about what's going on here, because of course the Trump administration doesn't actually care.
Right,
Of
right,
course, the Trump administration doesn't actually care about us confronting
right,
anti-Semitism. I mean, this is like the most anti-Semitic
right.
White House and government ever, you know. So I think the idea that we could like spin up all of this new enforcement and that would somehow keep them off our backs, you can't engage with good faith
Right,
around the issue
right,
of anti-Semitism
right.
with neo-Nazis and segregationists and great replacement losers. Like it's not going to get anywhere. And
Yeah,
because they're only here to mess with the university. So,
yeah. And what was the university's response to this announcement of the funding cuts?
well, I was in a meeting of the university senate on Friday, you know, like hours after this announcement. And the university president came and gave a statement, you know, more or less the same statement went out over email later that day. And it basically said, we're going to do everything to try to address the government's concerns here. And we are fully committed to combating anti-Semitism and addressing the problem. And there was half a sentence in there about the way we're going to appeal this decision. But it certainly seems like the official message from leadership is not to dispute the substance of the Trump administration's claims.
Right. And I imagine the logic there is that basically you don't want to poke the bear and that you're in a very vulnerable position. The federal government's much more powerful than Columbia University. So basically, if you stand on principle and you fight this and you deny it, then basically then you're going to go from 400 million to 800 million or something like. I mean, again, it's not an honorable position, but I mean, do you think there's some merit in this policy of appeasement?
Well, it hasn't really done much for us so far, you know, and I'm not an expert in the legal question here, but
Yeah.
everything I've heard from colleagues is that this is not a lawful decision, that we should be challenging this in court. It's not surprising the Trump
Right.
administration is taking unlawful steps every day. I would say that we are in a very difficult situation because as a institution of our size and stature and dependence on federal funding, we have spent years investing in a very strong culture of compliance with normal and reasonable federal regulation. And we have a very strong culture on and around campus of people who know their way around the federal government and regulation and everything. Because in normal times, this is how we do our work, right? And I think that means that we have a very well-developed set of instincts and tools for, you know, compliance in a neutral sense. But that points us towards compliance in a kind of negative sense here, right? Like, what other apparatus, what other way of dealing with this does a university of this size have? But this is where I would say that if we had at any point in the last 18 months invested effort in developing our ability to call out bad faith attacks on higher education or bad faith attempts to instrumentalize the pain and fear of Jewish students and Jewish community members, then we might have started developing some of this capacity. But how could we start now? We didn't practice pushing back against this when it was Joe Biden in the White House. So now we have nothing.
So your understanding is that Columbia could have a legal case here, but they're not going to pursue it?
I'm really not the
Yeah.
expert to
Yeah.
say on this,
Yeah.
except that, you know, we discussed this in the university senate,
Yeah.
and another senator who is more plugged into this said,
Yeah.
look, there's a lot of steps that the government actually should follow, you know, and actually asked the university president, like, are we going to be suing over this?
Yeah.
And we didn't get a clear answer. We were told they'd have to get back to us on that. So I can't speak for the decisions that the administration is making here. All we can do is sort of try to figure this out. But I think your basic assumption is right, that we don't want to poke the bear. I mean, so yeah, there's a lot more federal funding, presumably, that they could go after. But at the same time, saying, well, you know, let's
Right.
not do anything because we might make them mad. Well, gosh, Peter, I'd hate to see what they look like when they are mad at us,
Yes.
you know?
This has been a free preview. If you'd like to hear the rest and support my work, please consider subscribing at peterbeinart.substack.com.